Great. Welcome to the closing plenary of MR 2025. We're in the final lap here, and I'm just so excited because I've seen so much engagement, and thanks to you, the participants, those online, as well as those in person here at the conference. It's like the energy level has remained high throughout. So. Okay, so I'm just going to give it a chance to go through that loop again, but hopefully you don't have to hear that once more. I did want to just call out some members of the local organizing committee who made this conference extremely successful. The logistics, the signage, the coffee breaks, everything has been impeccable. So. Stand up if you're a member of the local organizing committee. Sheehan Moore, of course, the lead organizer and a postdoc here at the climate school. And we'll hold applause for the others, but if you're in the room, maybe you could stand up. Mirha Syed, who is a student of mine and has done a wonderful job. Jennifer Genrich. Jennifer, great. Member of the comms team, has been with us for almost a year now planning for this event. Haley Clint, who organized all the volunteers for all the rooms. If Haley's in the room, I'm not sure. And Omar Herrera has done a great job with a lot of the comms and other things. So Omar, thank you. So I'm really honored to introduce Jesse Keenan, and he's gonna kick off with a keynote address, and then we're gonna have an all-star panel talking about really how, in an era of climate change, we're already, in a way, in the US, we're in a housing crisis, but how climate change may exacerbate that crisis. And so he's gonna introduce the panelists in a moment, but I'll just stick to Jesse. He's the Favorite II Associate Professor of Sustainable Real Estate and Urban Planning at Tulane University. His research focuses on the intersection of climate change adaptation and the built environment, including aspects of applied science, policy, and planning. Keenan has served as a member of the IPCC in 3 consecutive national climate assessments. He led climate research teams at the Federal Reserve and the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. He served as an advisor on climate policy for the governors of California and Massachusetts. He testified and briefed Congress on various climate-related issues, served as chair of the U.S. Community Resilience Panel for Buildings and Infrastructure Systems under the Obama White House, has served various federal details, including as a senior economist at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, where he supported interagency climate and national security activities, including the development of the U.S. National Adaptation Plan under the UNFCCC. Besides his incredible accomplishments as a scholar and as a practitioner, he's also just a wonderful person. So we have been blessed to have him as a member of our organizing committee since the very first Managed Retreat Conference. And I can just say that he's been extremely generous with his time, and his help in identifying panelists, identifying people who can speak to these issues. So with that, Jesse, come on up, and we look forward to hearing your presentation on North, the Future of Post-Climate America.
Thank you very much for having me. I want to talk about a book that I have coming out this fall on Oxford University Press by the same title. You can go to the website. It's supposed to launch next week. It'd be great if it launched today. But this is what I want to cover with you all in the hopes that you can, I think half of you are probably cited in this book. But it's a simple thesis, and it's that climate change is fundamentally going to alter how and where Americans live. And we can divide and conquer this through a lot of different lenses, contextually. We can think about this in the context of mobility, climate migration, the role of the state in orderly and disorderly relocation, or the role of the market, as we will talk about, or even broadly, the standard of living and the American way of life. But for me, mobility is push and pull, and I know that's one of many different frames, but the mechanisms of push are physical risk exposure, and I go into that in great detail in the book, in ways that you wouldn't even anticipate. from infectious disease to hail. But it's also transition risk exposure, which oddly enough, we don't really talk about in human mobility and climate change, the transition risk side of it. As well as chronic economic stresses that we're going to cover on our panel today, and declines in human health and welfare, right? When we lose, we have loss, but we also are injured, and our own health is compromised. These are the push mechanisms, but there's also pull mechanisms in human mobility. The opportunity for reduced vulnerability, reduced economic cost, the desire or the amenitization associated with moderate ambient weather, increased social mobility, lifestyle amenities, and the opportunity for a sustainable way of life. Unfortunately, this is what we would call amenity migration. It's not well understood. In fact, it's pretty weak evidence associated with the pull factors, the amenity migration. In fact, most demographic patterns are inferred from negative amenities. Something goes wrong, you get pushed out. And in that sense, by and between sending and receiving zones have a very different qualitative story. I found it entertaining and inspirational to see the work at this conference that has attempted to quantify receiving zones, but I think in many ways it's entirely too premature. So the question is, who's on the move, right? This is a fundamental question to the nature of inquiry that brings us here today. And I think we have to organize it, at least I've organized it, among a series of cohorts. And these cohorts exist along a continuum, from the episodically displaced, which is probably most of what we think about, on one end, and that's certainly involuntary, to the electively mobile and voluntary dimensions of human mobility on the other end. There's also the electively mobile, and my work has tried to understand the extent to which the electively mobile, those with the resources, very often the wealthy, who have the labor skills, who can transition, who have that capacity, what is their role in the shift of capital? This isn't just the shift in human capital, it's the shift in financial capital, and we'll talk about environmental capital as well. So there's high transaction costs, and that shapes stress-based sorting agents. It's a huge body of literature and research on sorting and how people are making decisions based on the stresses and making trade-offs between their rent and their risk of loss. But we also have circumstantial opportunists, people who are largely agnostic to the orientations of risk, exposure, and the like, but are caught somewhere in the middle and in the moment see the opportunity or the value of the negative or positive amenities, the opportunity to live on high ground, if you will. So the question is, well, how many people will relocate? Again, this has been an interesting to watch papers and presentations at this conference. And there's a divide, right? And it depends on who you ask. There's competing perspectives. Demographers, by and large, say, well, people follow fairly predictable mobility patterns. It's mostly inter-county location or fairly local relocation, and I tend to subscribe to that. But they're pretty agnostic as to international climate migration, right? And if you ask social scientists of a lot of different flavors, like demographers, they struggle to incorporate adaptation into their models, into their conceptual thing. And sociologists are probably doing some of the best work on that, strangely enough. And among another crop of social scientists who are trying to understand or answer or quantify this, we've got agent-based models and gravity models and everything else, but they're really of limited value, and they're certainly not ripe for supporting planning and policy. But agent-based modeling, for instance, dependent on survey data, localized, it's difficult to scale up. Although I will say that we've seen work and contributions by a number of you here this week that I think are advancing us on the maturity scale, right? A colleague last night said we're maybe at an adolescent scale in agent-based modeling, but we're not there in terms of supporting planning or policy yet, but certainly significant advances, and I want to acknowledge that. If you ask economists, they say, well, it's really about, the predominant theory is about people follow the jobs, it's really about wage differentials. Some resource-dependent industries will relocate, but the market will sort of equilibrate around wages and opportunity. So nothing to look at. Next. So the reality is that no one really knows. If you look at it just from a pure exposure analysis, it's millions, right? We're a large country. Who knows? It's way too early to measure these things. Again, I found it entertaining and inspirational at the same time that people have attempted to measure these things domestically here in the United States. It's way too early to understand. This is a qualitative exercise. And one of the reasons I bring that up, and I think it's important to contextualize it, it's qualitative for now. It most certainly will be quantitative in the future, and I don't want to diminish the methodological advances in the nature of their work at all. I think it's just important to be time-dependent in our orientation and contextualization of the challenge. But you have to remember, and I think this is lost on many of us, that even small numbers of people moving, particularly in the context of receiving zones, can have huge outsized impacts in where they are moving. So we tend to, how many millions, 10,000 here, housing, we think about the scale of infrastructure and deployment, and that's all extremely important. But a single household in a neighborhood can bring new ideas, it can bring culture, it can bring an additional child who's in competition for pre-K, right? It is something we lose sight of in this context. Very often when I'm in dialogue, and have been for many years, about this proposition of climate and migration and human mobility, people always say, well, what about the Sun Belt, and what about Sun Belt migration? And I think it's important to remember that in the 1960s and the 1970s, air conditioning and sunshine, the marginal willingness to pay for sunshine was a real consideration. It drew people in. Weather was real. It had an effect. It shaped our preferences. But by the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s, this is at least the theory of Ed Glaeser, among others, that it was really cheap housing, cheap energy, and low-wage non-union labor that drew and grew the Sun Belt. That's important to remember, and we'll come back to that. There's a lot of research that, let's say, robust body of research that is emergent, and I think every year teaching us something new, that suggests we're at the end of the era of Sun Belt migration. The marginal willingness to pay increases for moderate temperatures and lower humidity. It decreases for hot and humid weather. Sunshine has a waning and negative influence on domestic migration. This is what the literature is telling us. And if we go back to Glaeser et al.'s proposition for what really grew the Sun Belt, then we would have to say, well, if it's about cheap housing, then housing and energy cost burdens are driving a dwindling affordability, right? It is not getting cheaper in Atlanta and Charlotte and in coastal Florida and the like. And certainly, I mean, this is RCP 8.5, take it with a grain of salt, but who knows what happens post-IRA in terms of levelized cost of energy and utility costs and things, but utilities aren't getting cheaper, energy's not getting cheaper, and it has a geographic distribution or a spatial dimension to it. I think some of the most compelling work with some colleagues from the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco who published a paper, Snow Belt to Sun Belt Migration, End of an Era, question mark. And here what we're looking at is a slope coefficient between, in this, the unit analysis is a state, spine between states. And the measures are number of extreme days above a certain gradient for hot and cold weather. And over time, you see state to state, yeah, of course, people are moving. You see the clear preferences, or what I reference as preferences coming through in this data in the 70s and 80s, but that effect wanes over time. And if you look at it on a county level, it suggests, well, not terribly robust. It's beginning to change. And from a rural county point of view, people are moving from warm rural counties and they're moving to colder rural counties. Now, there's a lot of non-climatic reasons for this. There's a lot of explanations that are exogenous to their argument, or external to their argument, rather, including exurban, peri-urban growth in the north and just urbanization in the south. But I think what's most compelling to their argument is that if you look at a number of different age cohorts, and we're looking here at age 60 to, people in their 60s, this plays out in their 20s. And by the way, this is supported by a ton of survey data that we see in the private market, particularly in housing and real estate market. It's inverse now, right? Just talk to older couples in Tucson and Phoenix about how extreme heat, the season, the hot season shapes their life, right? People are thinking, particularly when you're in your 60s, about where you're gonna settle. We're going to put down roots. And they're sensitive to temperature. And remember, we're an aging society. Where do you think this is going to go in the future as we age? Just in the context of heat, by example. So I think there's emerging evidence not just the marginal willingness to pay and preferences and things like that, but there's a slew of emerging evidence that I outline in the book that this end of the era of the Sun Belt is upon us. Now, North, and the title of the book, North, it's an oversimplification, right? Most relocation is really local. Transcontinental sending and receiving zones, it's very complicated. There's a wonderful paper presentation on intra-regional migration recently. It's a gross oversimplification. We sort of break this down between push and pull and the geography of America. There's places that fall all along the spectrum here, including Asheville, which, by the way, if we know anything about the history of American post-disaster development, Asheville will be a clean slate for more intensive development in higher risk areas that are rationalized by engineering resilience investments and will only further the crowding out of the culture and the people of Asheville. It's just begun in Asheville. And Asheville highlights that nowhere is safe, right? The idea of sending and receiving zones is a convenience for us, analytically and politically, or as a matter of policy and planning, but nowhere's safe. This is the National Climate Assessment, right? Extreme precipitation can flood anywhere at any time. Maybe not at any time, but as you understand, nowhere is safe. But I couldn't get away in my thinking over the years about ecological range shifting. And, I was thinking like an SES kind of person. Where do I fit in? Where do we all fit in, right? This is the shift of the live oak. This is from the USDA. This is over into, I forget the time dimension, 50, 60 years or something, habitat shifts. This is the highest incidence of observation of, also from the USDA, of the blue jay. I kept thinking about this, and of course there's this work where people have done on suitability, climate suitability and habitability, and a wonderful presentation the other day drawing these distinctions between suitability and habitability. But I couldn't get over this. And of course, if you study adaptation, you recognize that the formal physiological aspects of habitability, particularly in anthropological terms, are quite limited, right? Technology, behavior, and our own physiological capacity to adapt to a number of different events makes this a loose reference point. So the argument that I take on in the book is that, yes, it's direct impacts, but it's also fundamentally indirect economic cost, devaluation. I make the argument that spatially concentrated homogeneous belief systems, particularly concentrated in the Sun Belt, are limiting adaptive behavior. They're slowing that down. The state of Texas has no adaptation plan, right? You can pick this out in North Carolina, all throughout the Sun Belt. Adaptation interventions are being delayed. We have limited federal adaptation policy. In the book, I go through the history of adaptation science and policy, including the history of it in the US government. And even in, we've worked very hard for many administrations, but even in the Obama and Biden administration, we got next to nothing done in climate adaptation. And even if we were able to, most of that responsibility falls in the context of low institutional capacity and fundamentally adaptive capacity of local governments. We have there's 55,000 jurisdictions in this country. 2/3 of those are special purpose utility districts. There's tens of thousands of municipalities. There's maybe a few hundred at best hazard mitigation, maybe a few dozen adaptation, and only a handful, I could probably count on both hands, how many plans have operationalized to implementation stage. We have zero capacity. Doesn't mean we can't, could, or should in normative terms, but this is where we stand. And just to add icing on the cake, if it really is a local dimension, what happens in a post-FEMA world? What happens without FEMA aid? Aid is critically important to our economy. Susan Crawford, I thought was here earlier, she's gone. Follow Susan. Susan's been taking this line of thought among others. But at the end of the day, you know what happens without federal aid? We have bond defaults, municipal bond defaults. Expect further delinquencies, defaults, and ultimately municipal bankruptcies on our horizon. There's no getting around this, right? There's absolutely no getting around this. Clyde, Texas last year defaulted on their bond because of drought. They're one of 12 bond defaults attributable to climate change impacts in the past number of years. This is an onslaught that is coming and that will be facilitated in a post-FEMA world. One component of what I argue in the book is the climate intelligence arms race, that the private sector is dictating the allocation of risk-adjusted capital that's fundamentally shaping the decisions, our options, and our pathways for the allocation of public sector adaptation. They're shaping what our options are going to be. We tend to think through democratic processes that we will dictate who gets to move forward and who gets left behind. And very well, for some fortunate, very fortunate beneficiaries, there will be in situ and adaptation and relocation, as orderly as that may be. But many others will be relocated at the hand of the market. And I still can't get this geographic dimension out of my head. We can't measure this. It's way too early to measure sending zones and receiving zones and things like that. It's all a qualitative exercise, but I still can't get ecological range shifting out of my head. And this is high exposure, high social vulnerability, high flood exposure, low social vulnerability in the United States, the work of Eric Tate, who I wish was here. We can't ignore these dimensions to our own political geography. Mortality gives us a spatial landscape, economic damages. So we end up in projected receiving zones. This is the work of the PLACE initiative. Some members are here today. Thank you for coming. I'm not going to speak to their method. I can say that this is an exercise in a group of people who've worked hard to think constructively. And in fact, this is our map based on their work, but I think they have many iterations that have come after this. They're thinking, planners, designers, leaders in the built environment, about what is the adaptive capacity, what is risk exposure. But of course, it goes well beyond that. It goes to our capacity to socially integrate and receive, a welcomeness. There's so many dimensions which are nearly impossible to quantify. But it's an important exercise, and it's one that I hope we continue to pursue in the future. So yes, this is an experimental method that's outside the bounds of scholarship in many ways. But there are a number of observed receiving zones among here. One of my favorites is Ocala, Florida. Anybody know Ocala, been to Ocala? Okay. They have 50,000 home lots permitted, another 85,000 housing permits in process. Oh, reverse that. 50,000 home permits, 85,000 lots. That's a lot of development. And there's an enormous amount of data, survey data. I did interviews, Chamber of Commerce. Everybody knows it's one of the highest places in Florida. There's zero flood risk. Well, not zero flood risk. There's never zero flood risk. But you're pretty far from the coast. The insurance markets haven't caught up, although if you all know wind, it is the middle of Florida and it's still at risk. But people are being drawn there for a lot of different reasons, and climate is ranking high among those. And we can challenge that. But we have to acknowledge at least it's people's perception, and it is driving the movement of people and businesses. There's countless interviews that I engaged on in identifying Ocala. Ocala is a very interesting place. They have their own public utility that's gone all in on solar. Last year, the cost of electricity actually went down in Ocala. Imagine that. So it leads us to the proposition of climate havens and the peril of climate havens. And first, we can acknowledge that it's a creation of the media. Nowhere is safe. It's a relative concept. In fact, Ocala highlights that. It is a relative and comparative perception of risk. But at the same time, receiving zones are well observed across the United States and really all around the world. And there are some real critiques of climate havens beyond the language. It's the ethics of we benefit, you lose. It's crowding out. Certainly, climate gentrification is real in those terms. Many people argue that it's just marketing and there's false promises. Although, when we look at mobility decision-making, we know that marketing likely has very limited effect on this. Although, talk to the 15,000 Puerto Ricans who moved to Buffalo when Buffalo ran TV and radio ads after Maria, I think it was 2015. And there have been critiques about the false mitigation binary, which we know all well in adaptation. Oh, you should be spending this on decarbonization, not adaptation. A weak argument. But we should acknowledge, and I think we all do in many ways, that economic development, planning, investment has to be paired. It's not just about marketing this. But I think what many people overlook when they see the kind of marketing of climate havens or receiving zones or a welcome, however you want to frame it or label it, is that much of those activities are not actually for an external audience, they're actually to mobilize a local audience and mobilize local optimism around the idea of making investments to decarbonize and to de-risk, and to make investments in housing, infrastructure, ecosystem services management, environmental management. It's a local audience much more than it is about an external audience. And recognition of what's good for people today is good for people tomorrow. We lose sight of that sometimes. But there are some significant critiques. Jung Chung from the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition noted that a lot of the disparities people are already facing are just going to be exacerbated. Climate change is the climate heaven for those who can afford it. And this is very true. Climate gentrification is absolutely a challenge. And we have to acknowledge that, well, at the end of the day, land costs are the ultimate economic determinant of relative affordability, holding production costs relatively equal across the country. And if we have the ambitions for sustainable infrastructure, centralized or decentralized, we have to understand the extent to which this new development, this opportunity that we may have in receiving zones is internally conflicting with the development model itself. In that sense, we have to be critical of the models of both development and settlement in receiving zones. And so we can think, okay, all right, there's a spectrum here or a range of disorderly private sector development, and if we just let that follow people who are on the move, then it drives sprawl and exurban sprawl, and even the unwinding of towns. And I'm glad that we have a wonderful panelist who's going to be joining us, who I drew a lot of inspiration from his work. In this idea of unwinding of towns, both the economics and the fiscal economics and the like. But if we were to engage in a kind of orderly orientation to public sector planning, there's this debate. And it's an interesting debate in the literature: new towns, infill, sustainable redevelopment. But it's unrecognized, I think, the extent to which particularly infrastructural costs and the relationship relative to affordability are completely absent in many ways, and it's something I get into in a very critical way. So the promise of receiving zones, we'll leave behind climate havens, is many. Climate havens are fiction, we know it. But why is it that climate havens have persisted in the popular imagination in the United States? I'm sure one of you at least used that phrase in your presentations this week. Why? Why? We know it's not the right language, but why is a fiction, which was created by the media, why does it persist? And I think I turn to the work of Amitav Ghosh, who really highlights for us the affective mental models of migration. People are not just economic, rational actors. They develop mental models about a vision, a dream. It's an emotional dimension of what we leave behind and where we're going. And I think people are desperate for optimism. In full recognition of everything we know about the opportunities for immigration and migration to build social capital, to be unbound by social hierarchies, is a place to begin envisioning receiving zones. So warning, this is my opinion, that we have an opportunity to advance affordability, accessibility, and environmental sustainability in a manner that corrects the course of our segregated, isolating, carbon-intensive ways. Can you think of another moment in time where receiving zones and the movement of people, or just the movement of people? It's been generations since we've had the opportunity to think, and now is the moment to think about this in the context of urban and sustainability. My work in Duluth was very much misunderstood. What I was engaged in as a thought experiment and an empirical exercise was, what if a small amount of people moved to Duluth? How could you capture that in terms of sustainable urban development? What was that impact? Was the fiscal impact? Was the environmental impact? What was suburban sprawl looking like relative to higher notions of density and sustainable density for that matter? It was not an exercise in projecting what I thought was a good joke. Climate-proof Duluth. I got a big laugh from the audience, but people took it literally. The exercise was when small groups of people, 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 people, what happens? What are they bringing, and what's their capacity to engage? What can they afford, for that matter, depending on who's on the move? So the geography, and again, thank you, Places, I'm borrowing this, and it doesn't really matter the landscape that they provide for us. The landscape will be totally different. It'll be in Ocala, it'll be in northern Alabama, it'll be all over the place. It doesn't really matter, but what We envision a world where renewable energy and transmission itself drives some of our spatial logics for the orientation of receiving zones, particularly in a new economy or information or networked capital economy. Right? This is the creative dimensions that we need. So I think ultimately, at least in my world, I try to challenge these settlement patterns and development patterns because we have to think as a matter of policy, and this is my normative position, along a range of socioeconomic inclusive and exclusive dimensions of planning and capital economy, is, we can have mixed income infill with planned communities, sustainable housing. This feels good, right? This is what I'm arguing for you now. But we also are facing the prospects, and we already see this, of exclusive enclaves with high-performance housing and sustainable renewable energy capacity with private infrastructure, right? This is already proliferating. Because if we get this wrong, we miss this opportunity. Displacement camps in a very precarious state of low-quality housing and a degraded infrastructure state. The reality is all of this is going to happen at the same time, in my opinion. We're already there. So the final chapter of my book is a work of fiction. And the device that I use is the proposition for the partition of the state of Florida into two states, the state of North Florida and the state of South Florida, and the underlying mechanisms that drive that partition, largely economically and politically. And for me, as a nonfiction reader or writer, it was a wonderful exercise. But I think I will leave you with this, that we're searching for something. We're trying to quantify and measure and find climate grants, and we're struggling to put boundaries in the exercise of our scholarly obligations to bring discipline to this. But I think we can't leave behind the opportunity to be creative and try to at least catch up with the world around us in capturing the benefits and the opportunities that we have ahead of us. So thank you very much for having me today, and it's a great privilege to have you all, to be here and to see you all, so thank you very much. So I want to invite up, thank you very much. I want to invite up our panelists, and I'll start with Professor Stijn van Nieuwerburgh. I hope I'm saying that. Stijn van Nieuwerburgh. Steen's right? Okay, thank you very much. The Earl Kazis and Benjamin Shore Professor of Real Estate and Professor of Finance at Columbia Business School, thank you for joining us. Elizabeth Greenstein, Chief of Staff, Mayor's Office of Housing Recovery Office. Liz, thank you so much for joining us. Joyce Coffey, President of Climate Resilience Consulting, and Charlie Huyck, from Vice President of ImageCat. Oh, Huyck, and Nadia. Nadia Seeteram, who's joining us from the New York State Housing and Community Development Services. Thank you all for joining us. And our panel was to be framed not around in response to what I just put forward. That seems sensible. But to get your perspective on housing and climate change. We've heard enough from me. And so maybe if I could ask a few minutes, maybe a 5-minute sort of what's on your mind and what's at the forefront of your thinking. And Stijn, maybe we'll start with you. Housing, climate change, where do we begin?
Thank you. Is this on? Yeah. Thank you so much, Jesse. Great to be with you, Stijn van Nieuwerburgh, here at Columbia Business School. You know, I'm not a climate expert. I study housing, including affordable housing. And, you know, the housing affordability problem, as many of you know, has been getting worse in the United States for, you know, the better part of the last 20, 30 years. And climate issues are adding to the burden of housing unaffordability, both for homeowners and indirectly for renters as well. This shows up, the climate piece of the affordability crisis shows up most clearly in the cost of property insurance for homeowners. Just to give you one number, the cost nationally of property insurance has risen 33% between 2020 and 2023. Now, not all of that increase in insurance costs, by the way, is climate related. Some of that is just the cost of materials, sort of general inflation levels that have been rising. But nevertheless, the fact that these cost increases for insurance are much higher in more climate-prone areas, climate disaster-prone areas, suggests that the climate has a good amount to do with this. And so this leads to increased pressures, cost pressures for homeowners. House prices have already been rising sort of dramatically. Now there's the additional cost of insurance. Interest rates are already at a level that we haven't seen, mortgage interest rates at a level we haven't seen in, let's call it 20 plus years. And so there's a lot of cost pressure on these homeowners. Combine that with the fact that just in Florida alone, there's about 1 million homeowners who live in counties that are subject to flooding. And so there's a lot of spatial misallocation, right? So if you look in the last 20, 30 years, the average American homeowner has been moving into disaster-prone areas as opposed to out of. And so collectively as a society, our exposure to climate risk through the housing market has been increasing dramatically in the last 20, 30 years. So that's sort of, I think, front and center on my mind. With the rising cost of insurance, we now have a lot of homeowners who are foregoing insurance or who are being underinsured, which means that they have more of their own capital at risk, home equity at risk. That obviously could then lead to potential financial calamities down the line. There's some interesting work by Benjamin Keyes and Mulder that has sort of studied what happens to a FEMA program sort of right around a qualification threshold, and it has found that people who are just a little bit, let's say just a little bit too wealthy to qualify for an emergency loan from FEMA, those people are 60% more likely to go bankrupt after a climate shock. So this sort of tells us that there's sort of clear first-order impacts on households' balance sheets from climate risk, especially in these areas that are climate-prone. So maybe let me sort of stop there as an initial set of thoughts. We can sort of continue the conversation on some
Wonderful,
of this.
thank you. Nadia, I want to turn to you and get your perspective, particularly in your capacity, both as a researcher and working for the state.
Yeah, thank you. Honestly, Jesse, I'm processing everything from your presentation as well and trying to gather my thoughts. This tension between housing supply, the affordability and the availability problem, as well as trying to build for climate resilience or trying to, increase climate resilience. I mean, it's just, I don't have any good answers here. I'm currently in my capacity at New York State. We are running New York State's first voluntary property buyout program. And then in my capacity as a researcher, I studied both migration and then what is it that we actually need to do to sort of scale climate resilient housing in the US. And I mean, we are really stuck in this place of like thinking about affordability right now. That's a real concern, but then there's the cost of the inaction as well. And so, sorry, I'm really trying to gather all my thoughts here, but that's where I am right now. I'm feeling as though there are, there are the decisions that we have to make today, and sometimes in this sort of field, it feels like there are no real perfect solutions. But we, sort of can't. But we also have to kind of plan for this, this future that is, impending and coming as well.
Charlie, please, from the perspective of the private sector, but also your distinguished career in research.
Well, there's a couple things that I noticed, Jesse. We do a lot of risk analysis for a lot of different folks, mainly commercial entities at a sophisticated level. We do work for the federal government looking at cost effectiveness of different mitigation, but that's very, very smeared. When sophisticated risk analysis is expensive, and it's only to protect expensive commercial property and public property that it's done at a sophisticated level. And that's used to make decisions about mitigation, or what you call adaptation. It's not done at the residential level, right? Very few states even disclose to buyers, what their risks are, aside from the 100-year floodplain, which is outdated. And because there's not that knowledge there, it's not factored into the decision-making process, and that risk is not priced. So it becomes an externality. It's not owned. And the bank doesn't own it, really, because the bank packages it up and puts it in these REITs. They put it online. And if you look at that risk, all of the climate risk in comparison to the REITs, as compared to the market, it becomes a very, very small effect. So it's effectively unpriced risk. So I think that the first thing we need to do is figure out how to bring that externality inward so that risk is priced and is used in the decision-making process. And I think that the commercial market offers a model for that, right? When the commercial properties change hands, there's a due diligence report. Those decisions are used to inform mitigation. If we can figure out a way to sort of share the benefits of mitigation or migration, moving out of areas, based on pricing the risk, that would get us all moving. So I think there's a good model for that. The thing that worries me, though, and you alluded to it, is that that means that high-risk properties become an inferior good, right? Like rice and potatoes. That's going to be where those who can't afford, that's going to be where our affordable housing is, Tucson, right? And you may even have industries moving into those areas to try to exploit that labor. So I think we need to really look at those two things at the same time.
Yeah, I write about that, actually. Joyce, public and private clients, what's your perspective in being on both sides of the
Yeah, well,
coin?
maybe I'll specifically share something in response to Stan, your points about insurance. I mean, it is the canary in the coal mine, and places that can't be insured can't be part of the market. And so when insurance disappears, we also see a lot of options for homeownership disappear, which I think should pivot our thinking around more and more rental housing. And so I'm just off of the ULI Urban Land Institute annual meeting in Denver, and this is something that we were talking about a lot. Where does the private sector see opportunity? Where do they see resilience as an asset class instead of as a sunk cost? It turns out that CBRE, Jones Lang LaSalle, and others are actually maybe investigating whether rental properties, including single-family rentals, which have an extraordinarily bad reputation for being extremely extractive and unjust, could be the future of their portfolios, or one of the major future parts of their big capitalist portfolios. And I think it's fairly interesting to understand that they're looking not only at the quest for these new renters, so these might be homeowners that have lost their homes due to the lack of insurance or major events that have pushed them out of their places from those very major push factors that you just mentioned. But it also may be that they're making choices, these are big investors now, based on places that have lost a lot of insured properties and therefore see a very big decline in their tax base. And so I think we're seeing the start of a potential negative feedback loop where the loss of insurance decreases the stability of properties, and therefore, to Jesse, your point earlier, causes defaults on bonds or anyway a further deterioration of infrastructure, and means that where we wish that affordable housing might go, I mean, let's say that these are cities that still have some safe places in terms of climate risk, safer places in terms of climate risk, it will not, because there is not enough capital there or enough viability from the perspective of these private investors who are looking for the benefits of a very robust job market and great schools and fantastic health care that will attract the renters to their properties. So I'm really interested in the quest that I think many of the investors that we have spoken with, where they're asking, not only can this property or city still survive now, but can it thrive in 2035, in 2050? Because rental investment is generally kind of a buy and hold thing. You develop it and you hold on to it because you're going to be extracting rents and a big capitalist pie from that work. So I'm really excited for the possibility of attracting more private capital into rental markets to increase the amount of affordable housing that we have in the United States. And I think your opinion, Jesse, is really important. It's a very optimistic opinion. We do have the chance to create more equitable, resilient places. And especially we have that chance, I think, if we understand that some of those who are having to move due to push factors are willing to take on being a renter rather than a homeowner, because it might have been that prior American dream to own your own home, but in fact, ultimately the American dream is to have well-being. no mold and no toxics and no fleeing, your home at every hurricane season. So it'll be interesting to see whether affordable housing and increasing rental opportunities become a bigger part of what private investors are doing in the near future.
No, thank you, Joyce. In fact, I document in the book the extent to which a portfolio strategy is multifamily together with land banking. Then they both cross-collateralize and essentially subsidize the holding costs of the land in full anticipation of future development, particularly from a home building point of view. And multifamily, exactly in your context, is right. And I just want to acknowledge what you set up for us in the doom loop is the originator, in many ways, maybe the climate doom loop. So thank you again, Professor, for joining us. Liz, New York City, bring us home, if you could.
It's interesting to, first of all, thank you for including me in this panel. I'm speaking, my agency is an operations office, so we digest and put out the policies that our sister agencies put together. So I am somewhat winging this as an informed New Yorker, let's just say. But it's interesting looking at the map that you put up and also the little tidbit that you said that most migration is actually not very far. People aren't moving far. So when you looked at that map, the national map that you had, New York City was not an area people were leaving, but the rest of upstate, which is a significant part of the whole landmass of the state of New York, is open for places for people to go. I think what's interesting for us, so we have the rental market, right? New York City is a 2/3 rental city. We turn the rest of the country sort of upside down. I think we know, I see this as short-term, long-term, and medium-term, and figuring out the tensions and the trade-offs between that. What investments, in the short term, we kind of know what we need to do, right? We've recently voted in the City of Yes for Housing Opportunity. It is a series of zoning amendments to really look at densification to increase the amount of housing across the city of New York because we have a significant housing crisis. We have 1.4% vacancy rate right now, which means that there are only basically like 33,000 units available on the market at any one time, which means you're stuck where you are. So we know that we have to increase the amount of housing here. We know in the long term that there are parts of the city that are not going to be habitable. We have 520 acres of miles of coastline, more than most the beach cities that you think about. We have at least 500,000 people, to how you calculate, who live in those coastal areas, and that doesn't even include the inland flooding that we have. So we have people who are going to have to move. And we have a sense with long-term infrastructure investments of how we're either going to protect some of our coastline or start thinking about, and one thing that I've been working on is housing mobility guidelines for the city of New York. What do we do in the midterm? We have we have to house people. We are going to have to make investments for the next 20 to 30 years that might not make sense for the long term, but we can't also not have increasing amounts of, not even so much homelessness, but housing burden. The housing burden, the issue of you shouldn't be paying more than 30% of your salary to rent. We have significant burden, and the burden is even, within the burden, there are people who are paying over 50%. So what are the trade-offs and what are the tensions that the investments that we are willing to make as a city, but also as the residents therein, where we'll say, you know what, that might not be the right place for 100 years from now, but for the next 20 and 30 years, if we build resiliently, put at elevation, have a whole, make sure that that we're doing right for the people who are there. That might not be a bad trade-off just for now to make sure, but we have to all agree as community, as neighbors, that that's what we're going to do for our communities.
Interesting, so there's a lot of experience of that around the world. In many places, particularly in Europe with the great migration that we've had in the past decade, a number of cities basically made the argument, we're not going to make high-density social housing to accommodate these people with a long-term a building that's going to last 100 years or something. We're going to do this light building that's going to be temporary, and it's going to be designed, 10-year useful life. We'll deassemble it, and then people will assimilate. Of course, that's not what happens, and there's a lot of experience associated with that, and you get a lot of lock-in on a lot of different dimensions. And of course, then people are stuck in substandard housing. I'm not saying that's where you're going, but it's a huge challenge in terms of phasing, and there's actually some really interesting architectural and material responses. Stijn, I want to go back to you. You sent me an essay that that really caught my eye, and thank you for sending it. In Florida, you bring up a scenario that you had referenced in terms of equity, and I want to turn it now to the GSEs, Fannie and Freddie. And you set up a proposition where, major event wipes out some portion of equity of the GSEs. A very striking proposition. What's your thinking in terms of where Fannie and Freddie stand in light of reprivatization? Maybe a controversial phraseology there, but what do you think that role is? Do you think there's a role, and do you also think that international institutional investors, which have their own disclosure and reporting obligations, do you think that they're going to put stress and have some influence, if at all, on the GSEs?
Sure. Just for those of you who are not intimately familiar with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, just as a reminder, they're really insurance agencies in terms of their economic function, right? So if you get a mortgage from a bank, the bank will likely sell that mortgage on to Fannie or Freddie, and Fannie or Freddie will then basically split that mortgage in two pieces. One piece will have the default risk, the possibility that you will not be able to pay back your mortgage, and the rest of that mortgage, which is the interest rate and the prepayment risk. And that interest rate and prepayment risk then gets sold on to the capital markets in the form of mortgage-backed securities. Now, when people talk about privatization, they usually talk about the fact that the taxpayer, since the great financial crisis, is on the hook for that default risk on the mortgage. Now, in fact, what has happened in the last 10 years is that the private sector has been taking over that default risk from Fannie and Freddie. So Trump likes to talk about privatizing Fannie or Freddie, but in fact, Fannie and Freddie have been privatized already functionally in the last 10 years. So there's really nothing to privatize. It's just sort of a political stunt because the private sector is already bearing not only the interest rate and the prepayment risk on the mortgages, but also the credit risk in the form of these credit risk transfer bonds that have been growing since 2013. So now when it comes to climate risk, these different, let's say these credit risk transfer bonds, may have different amounts of climate risk depending on, where the houses are located that are inside these pools of mortgages, right? So typically, these credit risk transfer bonds are geographically diversified, so they will not just have Florida mortgages and California mortgages, they'll have mortgages from all over the country. So there isn't really a lot of differentiation in the extent of climate risk in these credit risk transfers that would either give us a useful price signal or sort of give us a new way of sort of deciding who bears climate risk in society. They're just sort of geographically diversified, climate diversified pools of credit, if you want. Right? So I think sort of point number one, the taxpayer has already laid off a lot of the risk. So, actually, if there is sort of a massive climate shock, it's for the most part going to be borne by the private sector already, the investors in these credit risk transfer bonds. And so I don't think there's sort of a scenario where, Fannie and Freddie take a massive, massive hit, at least not on the portion that they've sold off to these investors. In terms of, so then, why are, the other point, I guess the other point I want to make and that we make in the article is that right now, the way mortgage interest rates are set, there is no differentiation in your mortgage interest rate depending on the climate risk of your property. So you could be living in the riskiest part of Florida, you could be living in the safest part of Maine, your interest rate will be the same. So the way to think about this is that essentially we are socializing climate risk through the GSEs. And whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, that depends on your perspective. Like on the one hand, it's bad because we're not giving homeowners price signals on how risky the location where they're purchasing the home actually is, and differentiating interest rates could potentially be a very powerful signal to send to homeowners to say, hey, by the way, you can live here in this coastal property in Florida, but your interest rate will be 9%. Or you can live in Maine and your interest rate will be 5%. And if you do the math, that's thousands of dollars of difference per month on your mortgage payment, right? So that is very, very material, much more material than the insurance costs that we were talking about earlier. On the other hand, you may say, well, that's sort of a problem if all of a sudden the people whose property has already lost value in Florida now have to face this really high interest rate cost that's going to unravel the property market in Florida. And maybe there is a role for the federal government to essentially reinsure some of that risk across space in the United States. So that sort of depends on politically where you're landing on this trade-off. But I just wanted to sort of sketch that out as a possibility.
Thank you very much. And in referencing geographic diversification, I mean, there's 2 points on that. One, the volume of the market is driven by where the growth is. So when you look at these pools, Florida, Arizona, coastal North Carolina, so inherent, and there's not as much diversification as one would think. The other question that I have, and this is a quick follow, actually this is a rhetorical question, is how much of a risk premium do you have to see, right? This is the research, for that behavior, that price signal to fundamentally change, ultimately land use patterns. And in the interim, if we have something that isn't fundamentally changing the demand side of things, and it is increasing interest rates, and some people just bear that cost, we're still on the public side of the equation supporting them with infrastructure, right? So there's a lot to unpack there, but thank you very much because it's very clear, even for my own benefit. Nadia, I want to come back to you and turn to your research, actually, outside of your state capacity. Can you tell us a little bit about your research in terms of engineering resilience and thinking about resilience in housing and some of those underlying challenges?
Yes. I would, so just to sort of back up for a little bit, as part of my postdoctoral research, I interviewed about 64 climate housing experts, mostly in coastal communities, and mainly focus on the private and market rate housing. Basically asking them, what types of risk reduction strategies or policies or actions or anything are you employing right now? What are some of the barriers to sort of moving forward? What sort of enabled any sort of policy change? Anything like that? And if anything, what sort of tensions still are you sort of struggling with? And so when it comes to engineering and resilience standards, I mean, some of these, we're really talking for the most part, or much of this conversation has been centered on building code. And in this sort of interview set, we interviewed folks across, the housing ecosystem. So it's very multi-sectoral, meaning everyone from government officials to housing finance folks to engineers, architects, urban planners. Home builders. We tried to get mortgage originators in there, but they didn't answer our call. And neither did the insurance folks either, but the reinsurers did. And so what was really interesting is this question really depends on who you were sort of asking. So the folks in sort of like the design category, the architects, the engineers, the consultants, they really felt like building code is just completely insufficient, that it's sort of meant to preserve the sort of life and safety of a home. It's meant to reduce mortality. It's not meant to actually ensure the resilience of the housing stock itself. When you talk to the builders, they feel like the code is totally fine, and any increased costs would just, drive up, again, that tension between housing affordability and actually, and resilience, right? They would just drive up the cost and people wouldn't be able to afford it. So a lot of folks have actually, for people who are actually building beyond the code, that was something, Jesse, to your point, was something that could really be afforded by only the wealthiest people. And I think what is, really, and so there's this, this tension between the sectors. People really feel like, and with regards to building codes, the adoption process of building code is also very complicated in this country. FEMA, I think, has a report out that said that I think only 65% of the most hazard-prone counties, states, cities, they have not adopted the most modern building code. And so this tension is just there and it's present, and it speaks to what Liz was saying earlier and what I was trying to articulate earlier, which is you really are trying to, meet this balance of keeping people in a home, but also trying to ensure that, trying to keep them in a home that is safe, and knowing that if you make this sort of decision right now to sort of forego those resilience costs, you could be facing those costs later down the line.
Yeah, I documented in the book the extent to which building code versus code plus is often or historically, there's some evidence that suggests it's really a false choice that the home building industry itself has set up. And I argue that it's really about land use and zoning ultimately at scale, and it's something we grossly overlook. Charlie, the climate intelligence arms race, we have a lot of sophisticated climate analytics from which you represent a certain constituency. What are some of the limitations and challenges of that? Not to lay blame or culpability, but what do you see in terms of accessibility, and particularly public accessibility, if we rely on some price signal orientation to risk communication? Where's this information going to come from, particularly in the context of a post-NOAA or Trump 2.0 world that we live in?
Well, I'm more worried about the irresponsible dissemination of risk in a way that's used to make to infer risk that isn't actually there. You don't have risk that actually is there. That's something that I worry about quite a bit. But I feel it's an industry that serves mainly insurance and somewhat commercial real estate, but it really needs to be focused on what Nadia is talking about, right? It really needs to be something that's incorporated into the mortgage decisions. I think we've all been sort of saying the same thing. It has to actually be priced. Building codes save. They save lives. They save dollars if you look at losses moving forward. Mitigation saves. We know this. We've got the research. I've been involved in it, a lot of it myself. But it has not been put into action. It simply hasn't. So we have to figure out ways, and people don't do anything unless they have to, right? Only the very wealthy are going to build their homes to emerging risks, that are largely speculative. Based on what IBHS says. It's just not going to be the normal thing that we do unless you've got a school or a hospital or what have you. So we have to basically institutionalize it. I know that's not the question you asked.
No, it absolutely is. Oh. And you highlight that there's bad actors in climate services. No?
I'm sorry, two things. There's wildfire risk in the future. Mm-hmm. I think that's not quantified well. The only way to really do it is empirical. And if you look at the graphs for California, they're just going straight up. And that's what the insurers are doing. That's why they're dropping policies. And I think that hotter, wetter storms, slower moving in the southeast, that has to be quantified better because it's why people died in Nashville, right?
I overstate with bad actors, but it's an enormous challenge in quality and in validation, but also interpretation and application. Joyce, there's some thinking that in a post-FEMA world, we move to a block grant system where the states begin to take on similar community development block grants, etc. The states begin to take on full responsibility. They become freely autonomous in all sense. At the same time, states don't have that capacity, and they often go to experts and consultants like yourself to help build that, support that capacity, not just the states, but local governments, et cetera. Where might that be going if we do move to a block grant program? Certainly we're moving to a context where states themselves are going to be on their own. Is there anything good that comes from that, or what? I mean, I think we understand the implications and the challenges, but where might this go, and is there anything that we can think of that might be productive in this reorientation of responsibility?
Okay, that's a great question. I'm going to start by saying that I have really enjoyed this conference. It's my first time, and I've learned so much, and I'm taking this away. Like, cost-benefit analysis for me is way over one in terms of what I'm learning. It's in a cornucopia of, fruit and vegetables and a few nuts, and I'm over here as a lump of tofu, like very different. And I'm going to say that because, Jesse, I'm not going to answer your question directly, but I am going to talk about states. Because as a practitioner, I've really learned a lot recently about the states that are not yet doing anything about relocation, especially related to affordable housing. And I know at this conference we've heard extraordinary stories and facts about New Jersey and New York and several other states that are really making big moves. But that's incredibly, it's a small sample in terms of the rest of the nation. We are working with the HUD and FEMA money through Enterprise on a pre-disaster housing initiative. And I'll just give you the example of Missouri, who has absolutely no designs on climate planning or on managed retreat or anything to that effect. But their housers and emergency managers have been meeting for the last year on figuring out a strategy for what to do for disaster housing. And ultimately, it appears to me that the work that they're doing is in fact creating a retreat strategy for the state. Because, for instance, one of the major things they're working on is a housing resource platform, recovery.mo.gov, that allows for those who have experienced a disaster to find affordable housing for just the moment of recovery. But it turns out that the state doesn't want anyone but those in that disaster situation to have access to this incredible database, because there's such a lack of affordable housing anyway that that database will immediately be overwhelmed by people who need affordable housing regardless of a disaster, number one. And number two, both the emergency managers and the housers are sure that the database will result in people moving. They'll have a disaster, and they won't just go temporarily to wherever it is that there seems to be affordable housing. They will go there permanently, and the state is planning for that. So I think that's a really interesting way of understanding a more reactive or low-key managed retreat strategy for a state. And it does pull to mind another project we're working on with the Transportation Research Board through WSP, where we're hearing a lot from transportation leaders talking about decommissioning roads. And as an urban planner, I think about roadways and the history and the current impact that they have on segregation and incredible inequity. And now I realize that when we decommission roads, typically we are creating stranded assets of lower income people who now have no choice but to move because they have no way to leave. But wealthier people who are also on roads that need to be continually maintained with removal of sand or shoring up after landslides are often very loud about, maintaining their roadways. So I'm interested in this new redlining that roadway infrastructure and the lack of its repair and even the lack of it disappearing entirely will create as those owners and renters are left with nothing and really forced to leave. And these two stories bring up something else that we're doing with states, and I'll end here, Jesse, and that is that we've had the privilege of working with about 24 states on climate resilience for the last 5 years. And I'm gonna have a call to action in this very simple thing. It may be a big eye roll for you, but this is what we really hear from states about affordable housing, resilience, and retreat. So the trifecta of those things. First, it's really hard to have these conversations. That's what they say. Second, it takes a lot of time to build trust in community and work through processes towards relocation solutions. So they recognize community is a big deal, but they feel like the time is too much in some ways. But third, and this is where I think all of us come in, state governors and their staffs are saying that accelerating impacts of climate change are making relocation an urgent priority, and they're wondering how to get started. And the way that I think that all of us need to act on that wonder is to actually take our research and work to the streets and invite a conversation with state leaders about what we know. Because they're not actually reading what you write. I really don't think they're reading what you write. And if they are reading it, they're reading the abstract and they don't actually know how to apply it to their work. So I really encourage you all, if you have an interest in how, because I've heard a lot here about how states have a big role in here. If that's true, then we need to be proactive about serving states, even though they are to serve us, serving states with our work, first listening to what their needs are, and then helping to apply what we know to create solutions.
Thank you, Joyce. I documented in the book, and sometimes I think we're related sometimes, Joyce. The front lines of managed relocation in this country is road decommissioning at this moment.
Wow.
It's really, in many ways, setting up, and in fact, we see this all around the world through national adaptation plans. Liz, I want to ask you one quick question, and then I want to open it up to the audience, because we don't have that much time left. Not to cut your time short, though. But Liz, I was referencing institutional capacity, and I was queuing up Joyce for that and others. But wherever you go in the world, New York City is held as the model for capacity. You mentioned in preface that you're in the operations side of things. What can a town of 100,000 people learn from what you're doing in New York City? Is there any replicable model? Is there some way of internal organization or dialogue or communications? What can they learn from what you're doing?
Oh, Well, listen, I
You
preface
can
this by
pass
saying-
on that and just give us your comment.
Yeah, so, showing my stripes as a native New Yorker, like, we can be very arrogant here about just how wonderful New York is in the center of the universe. The truth of the matter is we've learned a lot from other jurisdictions.
Sure.
New York was late to dealing with, we were hit with Hurricane Sandy in 2012, and we had Hurricane Irene a year and a half before that, but there wasn't real action on that, and it was a very rude awakening. And we had to design a program whole cloth. The first lesson learned is don't design these maps are real. I think your call to action is an important one, and I want to actually pick up on that. This stuff is happening now. It's happening in real time, and if you think you're in a state, a jurisdiction, a town, or whatever where this is not happening, well, I'm being televised here, so I'm not going to say exactly what I would think, but maybe you should get up from under your rock, because this is really happening. And just as I want to point this out immediately in this time. For those of you who are from out of town, New York City is having our primary early voting this week, leading into next week for our mayoral candidates to be mayor of the city of New York. June 12th, Mara Gay, who's on the editorial board of the New York Times, wrote an opinion piece focusing on housing and need for housing, and lays out, we have to build affordable housing, we have to develop solutions for renters, build political support for multi-family housing regionally, and there's not a mention anywhere of climate. There's not a mention anywhere of the intersection between these because the coalition is there for the housing, which shouldn't be that we have to just think about housing or just think about climate. We're smart people and we're capable of solving for both. In this era where FEMA is going to be, devolving to the states and block grants, and I would argue that those block grants are going to be smaller because they're collecting less money in taxes and have slightly eviscerated the IRS. So there's not going to be less money, and I have a feeling it's going to be politicized, and it wouldn't surprise me if there are little strings that are going to be attached about words that they don't want to see your money going towards. All of those things, we have to be doing more, and every dollar that we spend on housing has to also be a climate dollar, and vice versa. It shouldn't be that you're trading off one for the other. We are smart people. The housing industry in New York City, especially, if there's a lesson to learn from here, is the robustness of the industry, the public-private partnerships that we have developed here. The whole nonprofit sector it's huge, it's deep, and we are all very smart people, and we should be able to do all of this in concert.
Thank you very much, Liz, and all our panelists. I want to open it up to the audience for questions, comments, thoughts, complaints. Are also welcome. Please, if you could come to the microphone for the benefit of those online, please. Thank you.
While they're getting ready over there. Hi, everyone. My question is about New York City specifically. I work here in the city in environmental justice, and I've noticed this kind of diametrically opposed thing happening where we're seeing these voluntary buyout programs and at the city and state levels of trying to help people move out of the floodplains that they're in. But then at the same time, there's a lot of energy and money going into developing additional housing in floodplains and in, on the coastlines directly. And so I'm curious what you guys would say about best practices on building in known dangerous floodplains.
So that's exactly what I was teeing up in terms of this tension. So we, and I don't work for HPD, the Department of Housing Preservation and Development. I used to work there, but they're the ones that are the lead on this, at least if this is publicly financed, right? So there are private developments that are going in. The Department of City Planning has put in their whole lot of guidelines in terms of coastal area development. There are places you can't develop. There are environmental mitigation issues you have to develop at elevation. But HPD works closely with enterprise, actually, on the green communities. So it's not just building sustainably, but also resiliently. So there are things that are built into that. Their utilities are elevated and so forth. It's a really big issue. There is a limited amount of land in the city. There are also communities that are resistant to development in their communities, to densification. My personal thing is to move the conversation away from affordable housing and more towards housing that is affordable, because I think that becomes a bit more palatable, because we need housing at every price point, because the vacancy crisis is across all parts of the community. But I do think I would like, maybe I'm being naive, I would like to think that these units are not being developed irresponsibly, but it is this trade-off about how many years are you looking at this. To your point about roads, so in New York City, it's less about roads, it's more about subways. So those of you who go out to the Rockaways know that the A train was made, was out of commission after Hurricane Sandy. At what point will we be taking ferries full-time out to the Rockaways, because there won't be another way to get there? And what will happen with the housing that is being developed there? I don't disagree with you. I just think these are very real existential tensions that are being lived in this moment in New York.
Thank you very much. Please.
Hi, Veronica from the Urban Systems Labs at the New School. Thinking about not building or limiting building in a floodplain, the recent Regional Planning Association report looked at housing needs regionally, New York City, Long Island, Westchester County. And the need accounts, there's basically less than half of the total housing needed by 2040 due to restrictions in zoning. So can you comment, the actors that represent New York City, about the need of changing zoning in regions north of New York to, for instance, eliminate bans on multi-property housing in areas where we should be building in the near future?
May I take that? Is that okay? So, yes. This gets to the notion of, well, what the RPA does in terms of regional planning. And for a long time, predating any climate conversation or Sandy or anything like that, the whole goal was to get TOD, transit-oriented development, out in Nassau County, for instance, and also in Jersey. So what RPA was setting up was a different broadside to a broader challenge, which is the state's inability to impose densification in and around transit, for instance. And by the way, California did this, Massachusetts did this, I was involved in those efforts. It's extremely controversial because nobody really wants that density or that housing typology or whatever it may be. So just to give you some contextualization, but I think what you're leading to is, and what they are leading to is a very, very important dimension, in part, not only for what it represents in terms of housing, but what it also represents in terms of ridership and revenue and for the mass transit agencies. And this is true all across the country. So it's I think, a critical tool or policy mechanism that can support an awful lot. Now, interestingly enough, we've done a fair amount of work on mass transit and rails, and they have their own exposure in low-lying coastal areas and like, but so it's not an easy thing. Please.
Yeah, thank you so much for this panel. My name is Moira Burse. I'm a senior fellow with the Climate and Community Institute, and with colleagues, we've been looking into the property insurance crisis from a housing justice perspective. And so I really appreciate the discussion today, and want to hear both from researchers like Dr. Nieuwerburgh, but also practitioners and policymakers on this panel. How are you seeing this crisis playing out in multifamily housing, right? A lot of the stats provided were about homeowners, but what we're beginning to see in our research is the way that subsidized affordable housing providers are being unable to build new housing or even maintain existing housing, and I presume that that's true as well for for-profit multifamily housing and single-family rental housing. And so I'd love to hear how that's come up in your work and your research. Thanks.
I'll just say one thing about this, which I think this is an interesting point. If you have deeply affordable housing, then essentially these properties, there is no cash flow. The rent revenues, because the rents are low, is equal to the cost of running these properties. So if you now increase the costs because of the insurance costs going up, doubling or tripling in some places, like in South Florida, all of a sudden these properties no longer break even. And that's when you get to the point where there is under maintenance. For example, people try to cut corners elsewhere, and the properties are sort of slowly falling apart, right? So I think you're absolutely right to point this out. And I'd like to point out that these properties are particularly vulnerable to insurance cost increases, right? So what do we do about it? That's a difficult question. One possibility is to somehow subsidize the insurance. Again, I'm not necessarily advocating for this, but if you look at what, for example, Florida or sort of in California, the FAIR Plan has done is essentially a government bailout of the insurance sector, at least making sure that there's some insurance available for these properties, because many of the problems are the same as for the homeowners. Without insurance, there's no mortgage. A lot of these mortgages are also Fannie and Freddie mortgages for multifamily. And without a mortgage, the property value falls apart, right? So there is sort of this, in this ecosystem, we have to keep insurance alive, which is why, the governor of Florida, who is a, very Republican, decided to essentially have a socialist insurance system in the state of Florida, which is an incredible irony if you think about it. But that's why, is because they cannot afford to let the whole ecosystem of housing fall apart.
In the interim, it's really about lower coverage and higher deductibles. And HUD passed an interpretation of a rule that allowed that to happen. And so what you see is, just channeling Ben Keyes, who's made this point recently, it's just lower and lower coverage, and they're offsetting that for now. That's the stopgap mechanism. But there is some thinking that there may be types of credit facilities or different layers of insurance that you can buy into that cover some of that deductible or uninsured component of your risk. And interestingly enough, there is a model in Florida among condominiums and master condominium associations to self-insure, co-insure among each other. And there's been a lot of talk about that in New York City over the years, where different cooperative models could exist to cover some portion of what the market's not covering. But that sets up some sub-systematic risk that's quite problematic.
I just want to add, there is a lot, this is not my universe, but I do read the housing trades, and this is a very big issue in the affordable housing, in housing in general development in New York City, because we are mostly multifamily here. So if you want to connect with people who are doing this, this is the topic of conversation, both at the agency level and with the developers, and it's hitting particularly the nonprofits that are the partners for these organizations.
Please.
Hi, thanks to the panelists for being here. My name is Hannah Troutwine. I work for a nonprofit recovery and resilience organization out of New Orleans called SBP. Joyce, your call to action particularly resonated with me, as this is my first time at this conference and thinking about how we get the information in these rooms to communities in a hearable way. My boss would be mad, and I'd be remiss if I didn't take the opportunity to show. We have a few fellows in the room. I have the privilege of leading a fellows program where we hire fellows locally from disaster-prone communities to sit with local governments to try to have these conversations. And so we have folks from California, Alabama, North Carolina here, and Joyce, your point about trust and how that matters in communities, how you have to build this level of partnership and trust until you can actually have these conversations, just really makes me think, even early in my career, it's unsettling that academia and business and government and nonprofits can't seem to play well with each other. And so maybe the question is, how have you seen those partnerships work in any of your experiences? And also just an open opportunity to the room if you'd like to talk more about your research and how we can maybe use that in fellows communities. I would really welcome that. Thank you.
Well, I'll take a quick answer. One, I do think, and this is something that was mentioned in a panel or a session just before this, there is a lot of checking the box in the intersectoral work, public-private partnerships that engage communities. It's like, well, you're engaging the community because you had a community meeting, so now that's done. So I think we have some really big work to do to continue to try to actually work from community leaders and have them lead if they want to, and lead what they want. But one other thing I'm going to say, and I feel comfortable saying this because I'm the private sector, one of the private sector people on this panel, but I think generative AI can help us. And the way that I think that that might work, for instance, in the context of what you're saying, is that we often have trouble hearing each other because we're not talking in the same language. So let's say I had written a paper that was about how a state is working and then identifying some problems that that state had. But if I go to that state with that paper and my conclusions, I think I'm going to get like a lot of pushback. But if I ask generative AI, like what are the things that are currently worrying the Department of Natural Resources for state X, or what have they recently been working on, and how does that relate to my paper? It would be interesting to see what generative AI came up with, because that might be something that I could then go and say, I've been reading about this cool thing you're working on, and maybe I have something to contribute to that. And I think that that's true for any time that we bring oil and water together, or big money and those who hate capitalism together, or whatever. Is we have to find that common ground. And I'm a very opinionated person, and I found that generative AI can help me to erode my opinions and just be a better listener, because it is not opinionated in the same way that I am. And so it's just a bit of a suggestion that I'm sure many people will disagree with.
Thank you very much. In the interest of time, we really have enough time for one more question, please. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you again to the panel and the speaker. My name is Kelly Leilani Main. I'm the Executive Director of Buy-in Community Planning, and we help communities design and implement voluntary home buyout programs. So there's been a lot of research and scholarship on the problems with post-disaster buyout programs. Most of the communities that we're working with are environmental justice communities facing chronic and compounding hazards, one of which is also declining home values, or the inability to actually sell their home on the market, what we might call stranded households. And so I'm wondering, given what we're seeing with slightly shifting price signals, either the slowing of increases in home values in places like Florida, or even declines in home value in certain places, how does the loss of this massive asset for millions of Americans in declining home values affect some of the migration patterns that we've talked about, or the implications for policy? And if buyouts aren't necessarily the solution because they're too expensive or complicated to implement, what are some of the other policy mechanisms or private sector involvement that can rehouse people that are in declining real estate assets in terms of value?
Charlie, you talked about
this. That's your next panel, Jesse. You got to do that in 2 years.
Yeah.
That's my only answer.
Please, anybody want to jump in on that? Liz?
No, I'm just
Stijn,
shifting.
Please.
That is the question.
Yeah.
It's a very good. Go ahead.
Oh, no, please.
Nobody wants to answer.
I mean, I think it sort of illustrates a fundamental tension, which is, if you need to relocate people from climate-exposed areas to climate-safer areas, that trade is going to cost money, right? Because the housing will be more expensive in the climate-safe area than in the climate-risky area. And sort of to the extent that these price signals are now beginning to materialize, as they are, as you point out, people are going to lose home equity in vulnerable places. And even if they're able to sell their house, they're going to be able to sell it for less. Then that was the down payment for the next house. So now either they have to take more debt, or potentially they cannot afford to buy it at all anymore, and now they're sort of forced into rentership, right? So they had this asset, we sort of talked about owning versus renting before. One of my fellow panelists was sort of suggesting maybe we need to evolve more towards a rentership society. I'm personally not in favor of that. I'm a big believer in home ownership and sort of the wealth building aspects of home ownership, but unfortunately, some households might be forced into rentership, as part of this trade of moving to a climate safer area.
Yeah. Well, let me thank all of our panelists and thank all of you for joining us here today and coming all the way to Newark. Thank you.
Great. What a wonderful panel. What a wonderful keynote address by Jesse as well. So this afternoon, we have more sessions. Fortunately, we've organized really bad weather, so if you're tempted to go and do some tourism activities, it's going to be raining, so just stay here and be with us. The other thing I wanted to mention is we will be sending out a a survey of this conference to all participants, and we really encourage you to give your candid feedback. We already received the message that we could have had some cookies or some donuts or something during the coffee break, so we apologize for that. But if there is anything else you think, topics that you think we're missing, things that we might have brought up, we really want to hear from you. So again, thank you for attending this conference, and we don't have a grand finale. You'll be in separate sessions at the end, but we do hope you enjoy the rest of your stay in New York and have a safe trip back to wherever you came from.